also in studio this afternoon just to unpack further is International Relations Analyst Ayesha Kajee. Ayesha, a very good afternoon to you and thank you so much for coming in. As you've heard Sophie there, it's going to be possibly a long night for us, given too that there is so much uncertainty. I want you to give us further context around this decades-long, conflict. I mean, there are now a number of questions in terms of the real reasons for this latest attack by Israel on Iran on the 13th of June 2025, when Israel launched that preemptive strikes against Iran, citing a nuclear threat. What is this threat?
Actually, I think it's a mythical threat, quite frankly, right now. Good afternoon to you and your viewers as well. I say mythical threat because Israel has been peddling this line since the 1970s. It peddled this line against Iraq, as Sophie so rightly said, but it's been peddling the possibility of a war with Iran for a very, very long time now. And every time it says Iran is in imminent capacity of making nuclear armaments. Now, I'd like to actually really unpack this idea of Iran being an existential threat to Israel, and particularly Israel taking so-called preemptive measures against a possible nuclear arming of Iran. Firstly, that arises from the IAEA inspection recently and the announcement last week that for the first time in 20 years, the IAEA says that Iran may have exceeded, nuclear enhancement beyond power generation. So the IAEA chief has gone on public record, on news bulletins, saying Iran is nowhere near making nuclear armaments right now. So that reasoning of Israel, firstly, is faulty. Secondly, on the issue of an existential threat, let me ask you just very clearly, which state in the Middle East region has been responsible just over the past month for attacking at least 4 other nations or peoples? Israel is carrying out not just a genocide, but now a Holocaust in Gaza. It's carrying out ethnic cleansing in the West Bank. So it's aggressive against the Palestinians. It's invaded parts of Syria. It's invaded parts of Lebanon, or been aggressive towards the Lebanese, just in the past month. And now these so-called preemptive strikes on Iran. So who really is the existential threat in the region here?
And in fact, just to go back to that, the director of the AIEA, Rafael Grossi, in fact, he says, we did not find in Iran elements to indicate that there is an active systemic plan to build a nuclear weapon.
Absolutely.
But there have been concerns, of course, even from their side, saying that, they're just looking at certain compliance issues as it relates to nuclear obligations. But thanks so much for unpacking that. We spoke to our correspondent earlier today, of course, the question around the US and its position. There is no clear direction at the moment from President Trump in terms of what is going to be happening. He's having an intelligence meeting happening right now as we speak. I would imagine it's already started. There were discrepancies between President Trump and his Director of National Intelligence too, in terms of, those nuclear weapons in Iran. So one then wonders what is going to be happening. But what would an America entering the fray here into this war mean for Iran?
I think what it would mean for the world is more important, frankly. For Iran, it would mean that Iran would face support for Israel at an unprecedented level. We have seen how that support for Israel has played out in Gaza and the West Bank over the last 20 months, particularly in Gaza. Without US support and US weapons, Israel would not have managed this genocide in Gaza. It would have had to give up, quite frankly, within a couple of months. And so the same really applies to Iran. If the US were to actively support Israel in its war with Iran, in other words, provide bunker buster bombs, etc., then we would see a very, very vulnerable Iran. However, some Iranian analysts have gone on record saying that Iran has actually been very restrained. It hasn't shown its full military capability yet, because it is reserving that in the event that the US enters the fray on the side of Israel.
Yeah.
So it doesn't want to actually reveal what is possible, but it has revealed that it has been able over the past couple of days to strike southern parts of Israel, including a hospital, including downtown Tel Aviv as well. So that is not to say that Iran is totally vulnerable. Israel has tried to attack at a time when Iran's so-called proxies in the region have been weakened, Hezbollah, Hamas, etc. And it's seeing a weakened Iran as a soft target. But it may actually live to regret that decision. And we must also look really at Prime Minister Netanyahu's personal objectives for continuing warfare in the region, because it keeps him in power at a time when he's facing domestic court charges as well as being indicted by the International Criminal Court.
And some have also suggested that it also could be a deflection of what's happening in Gaza, but I'll come back to that point. I want to just go back to that clip that we heard earlier on when we were talking to Sophie, the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, saying that there is a sense of impunity, also talking and questioning the leadership. So we know, of course, that the G7, from the G7 summit, the leaders have spoken, not quite calling for a cessation of sorts or a ceasefire, but calling one for Gaza. What do we read into just the language that we're hearing from the leadership in as far as this particular conflict is concerned, and what should we actually be hearing?
Well, the language has been very restrained in terms of calling for a ceasefire. Yes, there have been the calls, but they've not been made in any kind of strident tones. There's not been any threat of repercussions for Israel if it does not stop its aggression in Gaza and its aggression on Iran, just two out of the various countries I mentioned earlier. So there's a sense that there's tacit backing for Israeli measures, both in Gaza and in Iran and in the West Bank and elsewhere, by the leaders of most of the G7 nations. However, their people have come out in massive support of Gaza particularly, and of Palestine in general. And we've seen that over the last year. There's been a shift. And so these leaders are going to become very unpopular domestically if they do not at least pay lip service to the idea of a ceasefire and pay lip service to the idea of not getting involved in what could potentially become a global war with Iran.
All right, Ayesha, unfortunately, I have run out of time. Thank you so much. I would imagine that given the fact that there is speculation that this conflict is going to be extended for weeks to come, that you will most certainly be back commenting on and just giving us analysis around these matters. But thank you so much for that.
Thank you very much for that. And just to remind everyone, Israel has not signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and we have evidence since the 1970s that it does have at least 80 to possibly 400 nuclear warheads. So it's not the one in breach of its obligation. It's the one in breach of its obligations, not Iran.
All right. All right. Thank you so much for your views. That's the International Relations Analyst, Ayesha Kajee. Thank you so much for your time.